My name is Robert McCoy. I'm an architect. I have a Bachelor of Architecture from the University of California in Berkeley in 1963. Been licensed in California since about 1964. From about 1965 until about 1985, most of my experience has been in high-rise, multi-story steel buildings. The first major high-rise building that I was involved with was the headquarters for Pacific Gas and Electric Company in San Francisco. It's a 34-story building, about 1,250,000 square feet in the high-rise portion, 288,000 in the low-rise portion. It was designed and built in 5 years or thereabouts, about the same time that the World Trade Center was designed and built in New York. In fact, we corresponded with the Yamasaki's office at the time to discuss certain aspects of their building and ours. Both buildings were designed, for instance, to resist the impact of an airplane flying into them. While with that firm in San Francisco, Hertzka Knowles, I also participated in the design of 575 Market Street, a building for Standard Oil, one of their headquarters buildings. It was 44 stories. 100 Pine Street, which is 34 stories. It's an unusual building with very large cantilevers. Interesting building. And following PG&E, I finished up the final design, redesign, and construction of the St. Mary's Hospital and Medical Center in San Francisco. That's an 11-story steel frame building, about 500,000 square feet overall. Following that stint, I was in private practice for a period when William Pereira acquired my firm to give him a presence in San Francisco. He had a couple of high-rise buildings to do, one of which was One Sansom, which was initially designed as a 54-story building, subsequently reduced to about 44 stories when Citicorp came into the project. Another building done at the same time was 505 Sansom, which is about a 20-story building. It sits adjacent to the Transamerica Pyramid in San Francisco. At that time, I also did the Building P at SRI International on the Menlo Park campus. That's about a 200,000 square foot, 4-story steel frame building for applied research in chemistry, physics, and lasers. As those buildings were getting underway, I was needed in Los Angeles and relocated to Southern California, where I was the project director and chief operating officer for the joint venture for the design and construction of the Tom Bradley International Terminal at Los Angeles International Airport. That building is about 1 million square feet. It depends upon where you measure it, but it's a good, solid 5-story steel frame building. A given footprint on the departure level, for instance, is in excess of 3 football fields side by side. It's a pretty good sized open-air steel frame building. Actually, my suspicions with 9/11, the events of 9/11, started almost immediately. In fact, the very next morning following the event, I had breakfast with a friend of mine who was at the time vice president for construction of Tishman Realty and Construction here in Los Angeles. He had been the project manager for one of the World Trade Center buildings, and I don't recall whether it was 4 or 7. But he was very familiar with it. We spent that morning at breakfast discussing what had happened, what we thought had happened, and we came to the conclusion at that time that there was sufficient jet fuel spilled into the buildings, went down the core, which is, as you know, a high-rise building is a donut in a floor plate. It's flat slab all the way around, a hollow core where the elevators and stairs, the ducts, shafts, and the rest of it are. We assumed at that time that the jet fuel ran into the core, burned as it would in a chimney, and created a fire hot enough to melt the steel. As time went by, I came to the conclusion that probably didn't happen. Those buildings in New York have a very strong exterior skin. The columns are 3'4" on center, and they're about 14 inches wide. There's about a 42-inch spandrel at each floor of steel. So the net opening where the window is, by the time you discount the fireproofing and the rest of it, is 40 or 50% of the exterior skin. When those planes hit those buildings, they were shredded the moment they started into the building. most of the fuel, most of the plane was torn apart as it went through the outside skin. I've seen photographs since that show that the columns and some of the beams were severed in the North Tower, which was, I guess, not surprising considering the force of the impact, the weight of the plane, and the speed. But the diagrams that I've seen shown that those planes were that everyone else has concluded the same thing I had. The planes were shredded. The fireball was on the outside. From what I could see in stopping the videos as I was watching them, it appears that 50, 75, maybe 90% of the fuel was gone before it ever entered the building. The impact, shredding the plane, will create enough heat to explode that fuel. And that fuel moving at 500, 550 miles an hour as it goes through, as whatever's left going through the building or on the outside is seeking oxygen to explode and burn. It was gone in moments after it hit the building, certainly not hours. It didn't burn for hours. It didn't burn much at all. So in rethinking it, I discovered that there were others who had similar thoughts. And that's when I came across Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. Let's talk a little bit about the impact on the two towers. On the North Tower, the plane hit about the middle of the building side to side. It was close to the top, but approximately in the middle, leaving the corner columns intact. Now, the corner columns are the strong columns in all buildings because they're the ones that are resisting the most of the overturning moments of the lateral forces in a building. The plane looks to me like it took out about 60 columns or so I read somewhere about 60% of the columns and some of the beams. But the building didn't deform and collapse. The nature of the steel frame for that exterior skin, supporting the exterior wall of those buildings, is a truss. It's a solid truss. You've got columns at 3'4" on center, and you've got 42-inch deep or 48-inch deep spandrels, beams at 12 foot on center, and they're all welded together. They're put together in a group and erected in the building in tiers, 3 floors high, several bays wide. The buildings were solid. They lost columns, they lost beams, but the building didn't collapse. The upper floors didn't come down at that point in time. I've seen some video that seems to indicate that the floors on the inside sagged over time, but even so, that's not sufficient to bring the buildings down at that point. On the South Tower, the building hit pretty well towards a corner and took out the columns along one wall, or apparently took them out, if not severely damaged them. Those columns burned, the columns didn't burn, but the jet fuel heated them up, and there was heat from the fire on the inside of the building, the furnishings in the building. The building, as the steel softened, you have to assume now that the impact of the planes tore the fireproofing off of the steel, so that the steel would in fact be heated from the burning of the furnishings. There was apparently sufficient enough damage that it caused the structure to weaken along the plane of that wall, and it began to cave in, and the building, as we saw in the videos, the top leaned over and began to twist, and then before it started down. Now we have the mass of that building from up above coming down in strong, it's going to begin to impact the whole building as it comes, as everyone has described. But it's going to come down in a pancake fashion, in a staccato kind of a way, bang, 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 bang as it comes. It's not going to come as a smooth fall. You're going to see puffs of pulverizing concrete each time a series of floors hits another floor. I didn't see that. I saw billowing clouds of dust when I viewed the videos. Now keep in mind that the steel that's supporting this building in the middle is very strong. I think it's 33K steel is what I read somewhere. That steel probably yields at somewhere 56 to 66,000 psi. The design strength on it is like 12 to 15,000. I haven't looked at these numbers in a long time, so I may be a little rusty on them. But you've got a cutting in half for a safety factor of the yield strength of the steel when you go from 66 to 33. You have a second safety factor built in on top of that when you go down to 12 to 15,000 or whatever the design strength works out to be. Those columns were probably 4 times as strong as they needed to be to support the dead weight above them. And remember, it's dead weight plus live weight. The live load in the buildings is nominal. It probably was 50 pounds per square foot live load. That load wasn't there when the building collapsed. I mean, that's a fictitious load to account for petitions and people and books and furniture everywhere in the whole building. You have point loads that are high, but the overall load is nowhere near 50 pounds per square foot. So now you have this building coming down in a staccato pancaking effect, or that's what we're led to believe, and the columns below just simply not there, not resisting it, not stopping it. And I don't believe buildings 1 and 2 came down at in a free fall speed, but they did come down, and they came all the way to the ground. From what I understand, the buildings actually accelerated as they came down, meaning they were not getting resistance from these massive columns in the center of the core of this building. The core of this building was very heavy. True, it was a lot of holes, like mostly holes, mostly voids, but it had beams in all directions, and it had columns on a fairly regular spacing, something on the order of magnitude of 33, 35 feet on center, some of them closer together than that. So it's accelerating as it's coming down. There's not meeting resistance from all of the columns, these massive columns inside the building. And when you get to the bottom of the building, they're huge columns, huge. I mean, 2 feet by, approximately 2 feet by 4 feet, and steel slabs of 7 inches thick on the sides, and a third one in the middle of 4, 5, 6 inches or so in thickness. Where were those columns? Why weren't they resisting and punching through the mass of the building coming down from above? Where were they? Maybe they got folded up and built into the debris pile, but that would take some very, very dramatic forces to have caused those columns to have come apart, disintegrated, folded up, and been buried beneath the debris pile. Let's go back again to the top of the building. Remember I mentioned that the top began to buckle over and twist. If this building were truly severely damaged at the floors where the plane went through, and came down as an intact block above that, I would have expected that continuation, the twisting and the tipping to have continued. I really would have expected the top section to have continued to veer off in the direction it was headed, and since it was still attached on the opposite side, it would have gone over the edge and started down top first. That didn't happen.